Hello, and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This is part two of our look at the general strike, which was taking place a century ago, well, at this very moment, in fact, in May 1926. If you've not yet listened to our first episode, I'd suggest that's a pretty good place to start. There we looked at the conditions of the coal mines at the time and what it was like to be working in them. We looked at the broader economic context in which this industrial dispute came about, and then the escalation towards general strike, the outbreak of it, the downing tools across all sorts of industries across the country, and then the remarkable number of volunteers, some of whom were unemployed, some of whom were aristocrats, who came out to try and break the general strike and stop the country coming to its knees. In this episode, we're going to look at some of the people who were involved, how they tried to negotiate and bring about the end of the general strike, and then how, in fact, it did come to its conclusion. So this episode, Richard, I wanted to kick off by talking about the person who, for me at least, is truly the hero of the story, and that is Stanley Baldwin.
Oh, how ridiculous.
Well, let me make the case for the defence first. Firstly, I think that Stanley Baldwin was, in many respects, an unhelpful Prime Minister for the trade union leaders and the left to go up against. He was fundamentally a conciliator in terms of how he approached his politics. He was, in fact, in many ways, the pioneer of one nation conservatism. That's a term that we tend to associate with Benjamin Disraeli, who diagnosed the divide of class in British politics, at least from a conservative angle, when he spoke about two nations. Well, Stanley Baldwin was the person who coined the term one nation to talk about bridging that gap and bringing people together. He also, lots of different things about his background, I think, made him a difficult person to cast in an unsympathetic light. His family had been involved in the iron industry in the Midlands. He was himself seen as being a very good employer. He had good industrial relations with his workers. He was a deeply patriotic man in terms of his approach to the national interest. In 1917, in fact, we did an episode on this some time ago, he remarkably and anonymously donated 20% of his own personal wealth, which was not insignificant, to the government to try and pay off the national debt, or to contribute towards paying off the national debt that had accumulated in the First World War. He hoped that this would begin a whole wave of donations from the rich people across the country. But in fact, very few people joined him, and it was a rather singular act of patriotic self-sacrifice. More particularly in the context of industrial relations, a remarkable thing happened in 1925 with Stanley Baldwin, which was that by this time, the Conservatives have got an enormous majority in Parliament, because Baldwin had lost the Conservative majority in 1923 when he called an early election on the issue of protection, i.e. he wanted to put up trade barriers with the rest of the world. And in fact, part of the reason he wanted to do that was because of his concerns about unemployment in this country. He lost that election in 1923, but then he won an absolute landslide in 1924. And at that stage, and as we have spoken very often on this podcast, because of the somewhat unrestricted power of a British Prime Minister who has a majority in Parliament, he could have done almost anything that he wanted. And one of the things that a lot of Conservative MPs wanted him to do was, in fact, to go after the Labour Party, in particular, to go after the political levy that trade union members paid that contributed towards funding the Labour Party. And Stanley Baldwin stood up to his own party on this and basically said, we will not press home our parliamentary advantage in order to try and do down our opponents and make it harder for them to exist and to challenge us. Because he basically believed, not in some sort of one-party system in which the Conservative Party would be ever strong, but that there ought to be a strong Labour Party as well, but that Labour Party had to be steeped and very much in the grain of the British parliamentary tradition. The final thing I just want to say about why Stanley Baldwin was actually a difficult person, I think, to castigate during the general strike is that he and the government were not, of course, part of the dispute themselves. As we discussed in the last episode, the mine workers' beef was really with the mine owners. Now, between them, they could have some general beef about the state of the economy, about the uncompetitiveness of coal, about the temporary nature of the government subsidy for mine workers' wages. But this was not actually a dispute with a policy that Stanley Baldwin had pursued himself, really. It was a dispute between a group of private sector employers who owned coal mines and the people who worked in them and their trade unions. And I actually think as we make our way through this episode, we will see that Stanley Baldwin played a remarkable and, in fact, benign role in this conflict.
I know you admire Stanley Baldwin, but I think you're somewhat blinded by your admiration of him in your telling of these great acts of benevolence from Baldwin. When Baldwin did these alleged acts of benevolence, they weren't for nothing. Baldwin was a shrewd political operator, and he knew that if he was seen to be benevolent or seen to be generous, then he might be able to get something back in return. When he gave his donation of 20% of his wealth to the government to pay down the national debt, supposedly secretly, he did so in such a way that those in the know could work out who it was who gave that donation to pay down the national debt. I mean, he wrote a quasi-anonymous letter to, I think, the Times about it, which is not the way that you give a donation if you want it to be completely secret. On this point about the political levy, part of, I'm sure, what he's doing there is he's trying to avoid industrial strife. He's aware of the power of the trades unions. The country has just experienced a Labour government, and he's worried that there could be a backlash by the unions against his Conservative government if they are seen to try to clip the wings of the unions. So maybe you could say that this is a generous act of his, not to restrict the political levy to the Labour Party, but it also could be just quite a tactical decision. And then the other thing I'd say on the political levy is he wasn't that generous, because in 1927, the year after the general strike, his government passes the Trades Dispute Act 1927, which does limit the political levy and turns it into a contracting-in situation where members of a union have to formally, separately agree that a portion of their union dues goes to the Labour Party, which was a way of trying to shrink the amount of money that the unions were giving to the Labour Party. As for Baldwin's conduct in the general strike, I agree that Baldwin was not as punitive as some other members of his government. His Chancellor, Winston Churchill, who we've talked about, had a terrible record of harsh action against unions. His Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks, was someone who was very ready to go after the unions in a harsh way, and Baldwin did sometimes restrain their behavior. I acknowledge that. And I acknowledge that Baldwin was someone who did like to think of the country as operating in a harmonious fashion. But I don't think that we should use that to alleviate him of his positioning on one particular side of this dispute. And the final thing I'll say is that Baldwin's conduct in the strike suggested a man who was emotionally unstable, really, during the strike. He was said to have constantly been breaking down into tears in the 9 days of the general strike. At one point, William Bridgeman, who had been the First Minister for the Mines and then had become First Lord of the Admiralty under Baldwin, was so concerned about Baldwin's state of mind that he took the Prime Minister to London Zoo during the general strike to take his mind off things. In his defence, his wife, Lucy Baldwin, a quite remarkable and formidable person in her own right, defended her husband and apparently told the Times newspaper about her admiration for the way in which her husband spoke to hold the country together during the strike. She said that when she heard her husband speak, and apparently she used to be with him when he did his radio recordings, and she would sit there knitting as a way of trying to sort of give a comforting aura as he's giving his broadcasts. She said, "I thought to myself with pride, here is a man." At least he had the backing of his wife, Lucy.
We could debate this very point about Stanley Baldwin all day, so I won't say all that much more, except to say he was an emotional man because he was a man who cared a very great deal about the country and could see how challenging this was for the country. And yes, he was shrewd politically, but actually what you see in terms of the political levy in 1925 is a man who sure wants to make himself look in the best possible light. You know, he's the Prime Minister. He's a politician who has to fight elections. He wants that to be the case, but he's still trying to preserve fundamentally the rules of the political game so that it can be a fair fight between the Conservatives and Labour. Because, like I say, that is basically how he sees the future of politics shaping up. And the third thing to point out is that he is not actually partial in the dispute between the miners and the mine owners. He is partial and he's very much against the general strike, of course, but he's always really clear to say that the fact that he's opposed to a general strike, which, let's remind ourselves, is a couple of million people trying to cripple a country of 40 million people, of which he is Prime Minister. It's perfectly reasonable for him to take the side of the vast majority of the country over the small minority, many millions, no doubt, but the small minority all the same, who are bringing it to its knees. It's perfectly reasonable for him to take sides in that dispute. He makes a point of not taking sides on the very particular issue which started it, and that's the dispute between the miners and the mine workers. But rather than relitigate the character of Stanley Baldwin, which I trust listeners will now accept is beyond reproach, Richard, I wanted to move us on to the Labour Party. Of course, by this stage, you mentioned it just before, this country has had a Labour government, the very first Labour government in 1924. It was a minority government. It was a short-lived government, but we had a socialist Prime Minister nevertheless. And also, of course, by this stage, the Labour Party has become the official opposition in the country and is well on its way to being established as one of the two major parties in the country. So what is their role during this strike? And in particular, the role of Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour leader?
Well, I think the Labour Party was somewhat conflicted on the general strike, as was indeed actually some of the leadership of the trade union movement, in spite of the solidarity that was shown for the strike. Most Labour MPs, I'm sure all Labour MPs really, deeply sympathised with the plight of the miners. Also, many of them were trade unionists. Indeed, some of the trade union leaders, like Jimmy Thomas, who I've mentioned, were simultaneously leaders of trade unions and Labour MPs, and had served in the previous Labour government. At that time, it was actually indeed quite common that someone could simultaneously be the head of a union or hold some other officer role in a union, a senior officer role in a union, and sit in Parliament as an MP. But at the same time, there were real concerns from the Labour Party about being seen to support a strike that could be portrayed as unconstitutional, illegal, or revolutionary. And you have to put this in the context of the times, the context of a time when there are fears of communist takeover in Europe. You've seen the Soviet revolution in Russia. There are concerns about anarchy and anarchists and anarchism throughout Europe. You have to put it in the context of the fact that the 1924 Labour government was seen to have fallen in part over controversies about Labour's association with communists, both in the election itself, with the Zinoviev letter, this fictitious letter that was purported to demonstrate that the Soviet Union wanted a Labour government as a means to foment revolution in Britain, but also actually the precipitating cause of the election itself, which was a controversy over the Labour government choosing not to prosecute a communist newspaper proprietor for sedition at a time when the Liberals and Tories thought the government should have prosecuted that communist newspaper proprietor. And so Labour was very worried about being seen to be on the side of revolution. This is also at the very same time that Labour has, in its conferences in the 1920s, passed resolutions supporting the monarchy, establishing itself as a party of the British Constitution, and there was worry that the general strike could throw all of that off. And so as a result of that, Labour's leader, Ramsay MacDonald, and some other members of the front bench were very reluctant to speak in favour of the strike. Ramsay MacDonald actually tries to give a broadcast to the BBC about the strike, which is very, very conciliatory in nature. The BBC blocks him from giving that broadcast, which was a bit of overreach by the BBC, to put it gently, and we'll talk about that perhaps in a moment. But that's the dilemma facing the Labour Party. And from the perspective of the trade unions, there's a lot of bad blood that forms around that. Ernest Bevin, the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, who assumes the central organizing position of the general strike, refused to share a platform with Ramsay MacDonald in the years after the general strike. He told Arthur Henderson, another figure of Labour's front bench in the 1920s, "I am not prepared to go on a platform in support of the leader whom I regard as having been wantonly guilty of stabbing us in the back at the moment when we had the whole forces of capital unleashed against us." And that really was just on the basis that MacDonald hadn't spoken up strongly enough in support of the unions. On the other hand, I think an argument can be made that general strike strengthened the relationship between the unions and the Labour Party in a somewhat ironic way, but let me just very quickly sketch that out. After the 1924 Labour government, which was seen as broadly a failure in domestic policy terms, there were many in the unions who started to think that maybe a political strategy, i.e. unions supporting the election of Labour MPs to win power, to form governments and to do things on behalf of the union movement, was not the right strategy. The Labour Party couldn't be trusted. And so what the unions needed to do was actually to adopt a more full-throated industrial strategy. This is very similar to what's happening now in the current situation between the unions and the Labour government, where you have the General Secretary, Sharon Graham, of Unite the Union, which is the successor of Ernie Bevan's TGWU, the Transport and General Workers Union, who is saying that Unite should cut its ties with the Labour Party and should adopt what she calls a back to the workplace strategy, which in other words is a term for abandoning the political strategy and going full in on the industrial strategy. And in many ways, that's one of the reasons why the general strike came about in 1926. Once the general strike fails, the unions think, actually, we gave it our all with the industrial strategy and we got nowhere. In fact, our conditions worsened after the general strike. So maybe we do double down on the Labour Party, but we hold the next Labour government's feet to the fire even more. And so you can hear that in 1928 at the TUC conference when Ernie Bevan says, quote, "Is the strike the only way to fight? Can we not fight by discussion as well as by starvation? Can we not fight by intelligence?" In other words, he's saying, we can go on strike, but we've tried that. It didn't work. Let's try a strategy of winning a Labour government and achieving our goals through politics instead.
You touched upon, and we're going to come on to talk about the potentially revolutionary aspects of the general strike shortly, because this is in fact seen and remembered as many people as being a chance for revolution in this country at a time that was particularly tempestuous around the world. It is important, I think, just to remember that these are the relatively early, heady days for the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which of course also included the murder of the Tsar and his family. In this country, Richard, how would the royal family, and of course the King George V is the cousin of the Tsar who was murdered in Russia, how would they be responding to what some people at least think could be the trade union barbarians at the gates of Buckingham Palace?
Well, I don't think the royal family saw it in that way at all. You already had a Labour government, and there had been much speculation as to what a Labour government would mean for the monarchy. And the evidence of that government had been warm relations between Labour and the monarchy. And indeed, many of those members of that Labour government in 1924 were themselves trade union leaders. Literally were sitting trade union leaders at the time of the government, and they were ministers of the Crown at the same time, and they were meeting with the King. And the King got on very well with many members of that government, including those union leaders. That, by the way, was a much more working class government than the Labour government of today, even though Keir Starmer constantly claims that he has the most working class government in history. Absolute nonsense. So they had a rapport. The unions had a rapport with the King, an interpersonal connection. The second thing to say is the King was aware of the desperate conditions in the mines. He had, in his life and his reign, seen and read about the terrible disasters in the mines that we talked about in the previous episode, where hundreds of men and boys perished in the coal communities of England, Wales, and Scotland. And he had tremendous sympathy with the miners. And you can see that in the way sometimes that he would confront members of the aristocracy over this. So there's a story about how the king on one occasion is at the Newmarket races, and he's at the races with the fifth Earl of Durham, whose family owned a great deal of land on which coal had been discovered and made the family even richer. And the fifth Earl says to the king during the general strike that these miners are a damned lot of revolutionaries. And George V is said to have interrupted him and said, well, you try living on their wages before you judge them. Now, this is not to say that the king himself was a paid-up member of the TUC, and he didn't welcome the general strike, and he didn't like the fact that the general strike was happening. But he was very keen not to be seen as being partial to the government during this. And so at the same time, the king is quite admiring of the volunteers who we talked about in the previous episode, who came out to undermine the strike as well. When he, for example, was given his newspapers and read about the stories of, for example, undergraduates from Oriel College, Oxford, who were going down to London to drive the buses so that public transport could operate in the city, the king scribbled next to that story, "Capital boys." And he was very impressed and pleased with the sort of civic mindedness of the British middle classes and others who came out to undermine the strike. What's also interesting is the behaviour of the king's sons during the general strike. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, and the Duke of York, the future George VI, the grandfather of our current king. Both of them were peers. We talked about this in a recent Matters of Interest, where members of the royal family, until Tony Blair's reforms, were also members of the House of Lords. And they would go to Parliament, and they would attend debates and listen to the discussions that parliamentarians were having. And so during the general strike, when newspapers weren't printing, except for the propaganda arm of the British government and the propaganda arm of the TUC, the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York thought, well, let's go to Parliament and actually listen to what the politicians are saying. And so there's this wonderful image of the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York, two future kings, sat side by side in the Peers Gallery of the House of Commons during the general strike, listening to Labour and Conservative politicians and Liberal politicians, having it out over the general strike. And they listened to some remarkable debates. George Buchanan, who was a very left-wing Labour MP from Glasgow, part of the sort of Red Clydeside contingent, declared that he was a Republican. And in the debate, he said, "I would abolish the monarchy tomorrow. It is not a crime to be a Republican, and I am proud of it." And you might think that the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York are furious with him or angry with him. But reports show that actually, later on in the speech, they were laughing along with George Buchanan. Because as the speech developed, George Buchanan was criticising the provisions of the 1920 Emergency Powers Act, which had given the government the ability to detain someone who was a known character and therefore might be at risk of deploying a dangerous weapon in the name of national security. This was very controversial because this was basically locking up people for being seen to be a troublemaker without any firm evidence that they were actually going to cause trouble. And so Buchanan was sort of saying in that, well, I'm a bit of a troublemaker because I'm a Republican, and I'm telling you in the House of Commons, where it's protected speech, that I'm a troublemaker. You try and arrest me. And then he points to Nancy Astor, a Conservative MP and a known prohibitionist, someone who wanted to ban alcohol. He said, "The noble lady, the member for the Sutton division of Plymouth, is constantly interrupting me. Now, I do not blame her. It may be a fault of her sex, but she is constantly interjecting. Now, I don't say it's bad, because I'm one of the worst offenders myself in that way, and I ought to get a taste of my own medicine. I ought to take it much worse than sometimes I get. But now, supposing she was seen near a brewery, she might be a known character. And the one thing I have in common with her is my anti-drink activity. And so he's making a joke that if she was seen near a brewery, people think, well, she's a known character. She might be up to no good. She might be there to blow up the brewery. So perhaps we should arrest Nancy Astor as well. And apparently all throughout this back and forth between Astor, who's interrupting him, and George Buchanan, the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York are roaring with laughter at all of this. Just one last image on the royal family to leave you with is the guards outside Buckingham Palace, who changed their uniform from their traditional red jackets, bearskin caps, to khaki military style uniforms with their revolvers featuring prominently. And this was taken as a precaution to protect the royal family. And going back to your original question, obviously there was some worry that the general strike could turn into something that was more violent and revolutionary. But generally speaking, I think that the view of the King and the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York was more one of studied interest.
The general strike goes on for 9 days. And as we mentioned in our previous episode, the walkout that really triggers it is when the printers of the Daily Mail down tools. And although the National Union of Journalists do not go on strike, the people who print the papers that they write for do. And of course, this is long before the days of television. It is in the early days of radio. So the BBC is founded in 1922, and there are radios that people have by this stage. But I think it is worth setting out, how do people in general find out their news at this time? And how do both sides in the general strike? And I do want us to try and keep in mind this distinction between both sides in the mining dispute, which is mine owners, miners, and their trade unions, and then both sides in the general strike, which of course is connected, unavoidably connected to that divide, but then is slightly broader and rather different. At that stage, it's the government and the trade union Congress.
Well, most of the newspapers were paralyzed by the fact that the printers are down tools. And so, with some small exceptions in particularly some local newspapers where you had printers who scabbed, or you could find volunteers to run local newspapers, the big national newspapers were not able to operate on the same scale. There were efforts to try to get around that. So the Daily Mail, for example, had a print works in Paris. And so they tried printing newspapers in Paris and then shipping them over to England. But of course, that means that the papers arrive much later and the news has progressed much more by the time that people get access to them. Of course, it also is much more costly for the Daily Mail, etc., etc. And so with the national newspapers not really operable during the general strike, the main source of national news came through two organs. One was the British Gazette, which was produced by the government and even had the crest of His Majesty's government on the paper, and the British Worker, which was produced by the TUC. The British Gazette was edited by Winston Churchill, and of course Winston Churchill is Chancellor in Baldwin's government, but you've got to remember that before Churchill became an MP, he'd been a journalist, very successful journalist. And of course, all throughout his time as an MP, he wrote many books. And so you had someone who was very familiar with journalism and also very familiar and skilled in the English language. Some people say, though, that Baldwin gave Churchill responsibility for editing the British Gazette to keep him out of trouble from meddling in the operations of the general strike. And maybe there is something to that. And maybe that does go to your point about Baldwin being a rather moderate figure compared to some members of his cabinet. The government thought it was really important to have control over information during the general strike. And so where they could find volunteers and scabs to be involved in printing, they redirected their efforts to the British Gazette. And that meant that, for example, even something like Hansard, which produces the papers of Parliament, and Parliament, as I said, is still sitting at this time. You're still having really important parliamentary debates. The Labour Party actually had an internal discussion about whether they should boycott Parliament during the general strike to show solidarity. And they said, well, as long as we're debating the strike, then we can continue to do our job as MPs. But the government basically said, if any of you want to come into work, then you help us produce the British Gazette. So there were no order papers printed for MPs, there were no records of previous debates and discussions, etc. And the circulation of the British Gazette was extraordinary. 7 to 8 million copies were distributed every day in the strike. And the government was so keen to distribute the British Gazette that it actually, in early days of airplane technology, deployed airplanes to fly over remote pit villages and drop out of the airplanes copies of the newspaper. Because, as we mentioned in the previous episode, in some of these pit villages where there was basically 100% compliance with the strike, there was no point picketing the pits themselves. And so what the miners went out and did is they barricaded the roads to stop the transport of goods, delivery goods, between the villages. So one of the forms of blockage was to block the transport of the newspapers. So the government said, well, if we can't deliver these newspapers in our lorries, then we'll drop them from the air. And that's in fact what the government did. On the TUC side, they had the British Worker, which was also an extraordinary effort where printers were called in from the strike to support the TUC. There were some printers who thought, are we not breaking the strike by printing a newspaper? And the TUC had to say, well, you're printing a newspaper to support the strike, so you're not undermining the strike if you're printing a newspaper to support the strike. But there was a bit of a debate and discussion over that. Interestingly, the Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks, wanted to shut down the British Worker and use the 1920 Emergency Powers Act to say that it was a seditious newspaper. The Daily Worker, the British Worker, had been extremely conscientious in stressing that the strike was not revolutionary, that it was a constitutional strike, that there was no effort to bring down the government, that this was all designed to resolve an industrial dispute. And Stanley Baldwin intervened and blocked the effort to strike down the British Worker, because in his view, as long as the unions maintained their commitment to parliamentary government and to the British Constitution, then let them continue to produce their newspaper. We don't want to up the ante in this dispute. You mentioned, Lee, the BBC, and at this time, about a fifth of households had radios. And so the BBC is in its early years. It's only 4 years old, but it becomes an alternative means of communication. Now, the BBC is officially independent from government interference, but there's heavy pressure put on its Director General, John Reith, to be patriotic and not to be seen as conspiring in something that would undermine the government. And there's a sort of dance here that's been done where ministers are implying to the BBC, of course you're independent, but if you do anything that can be seen to be risking constitutional governance in Britain, then we have this Emergency Powers Act where we can then seize control of the BBC and we can turn it into another version of the British Gazette. And so Reith makes some calls which are very controversial. I mentioned earlier that he shut down Ramsay MacDonald from giving a broadcast to the nation. He allows Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, to give a broadcast to the nation. That's seen by many in the trade union movement as unfair. He blocks the Archbishop of Canterbury from giving a broadcast to the nation, where the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, talks about the need for reconciliation and talks about the legitimate concerns and cause of the miners and about having a fair and just settlement for the miners. But the BBC refuses to allow him to broadcast that speech. And so the pit villagers hear about this and they become very supportive of the Church of England and much less supportive of the BBC. The BBC takes on a new acronym in some elements of the trades union movement, the BFC, the British Falsehoods Company. Whereas there were reports that during the general strike, on the 9th of May, which was the Sunday of the general strike, in working class communities, the church pews were fuller than normal in the Church of England churches to show their support for the Archbishop.
It's clearly a remarkable dance. I think that's a good word to use, that John Reith is having to play during this time, partly because the BBC is not as well established as it today is. It doesn't yet have its royal charter, that's on its way. It doesn't yet have its news role that it's occupied in many people's minds over the years. And John Reith is, like you say, he's got this prospect of Churchill could walk in and do to the BBC, or do through the auspices of the BBC, what he's been doing through the British Gazette every day. So there's a very difficult balance, I think, for John Reith to strike. And that the BBC survives and goes on to get its charter and becomes the institution that it does, I think probably suggests that whilst I doubt he was proud of all of the decisions that he made, they were probably the decisions that he had to make in that context. And I think in part, to move us on to a theme that we've flirted with throughout these two episodes, it's because there's this question about the constitutionality of general strike. And to say something about the BBC's position on that, of course, it's one thing to say that we will aim, as the BBC has done ever since, to be neutral on questions of politics, but the very constitutionality of the country is not necessarily something on which even a neutral news organisation would feel that it has to be unbiased about. And you also mentioned earlier on that for the Labour Party and for Ramsay MacDonald, there were huge concerns that if they are seen as being the unabashed champions of general strike, then they will be seen as putting themselves on the side of a movement that is unconstitutional, illegal, and revolutionary. Of that triptych of failings, we can dismiss the idea that it was illegal. It is just worth saying that it was not an illegal strike. There was a speech made in Parliament by Sir John Simon that alleged it was illegal, but quite clearly it wasn't, and it wasn't really something taken up by the government, and certainly not by Baldwin. And in fact, when they legislated in 1927, the New Trade Union Disputes Act, they banned solidarity strikes, which rather suggests that they weren't illegal beforehand. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had to ban them. The questions of constitutionality and whether or not these were revolutionary acts are more nuanced and more interesting. So, Richard, why don't you start by offering your perspective, and then I'll see to what extent I can force myself to agree or dissent.
Well, the rhetorical framing of the Conservative government was throughout the general strike that this was an unconstitutional strike. What they meant by that was that this was a strike designed to bring down an elected government using industrial means. On the first day of the strike, when Parliament gathers on the 4th of May, a Tuesday, at 2:45 in the afternoon, and the Commons is absolutely packed, the gallery is full, you have many leaders of the trade union movement, either on the Labour benches or in the gallery, and Stanley Baldwin in his speech says that the TUC had moved the country, quote, nearer to proclaiming civil war than we have had for centuries past. And the Times newspaper excitedly called the general strike the most perilous moment in British history since the Stuart times, since the Civil War. The government does that for a couple of reasons. One is to use it as a predicate to activate the Emergency Powers Act. Two, to use it to prosecute communists in particular. And so it said that about half of the membership of the Communist Party of Great Britain was arrested during the general strike. Now, I should say that the membership of the Communist Party of Great Britain was not that big. It's about 5,000, so about 2,500 communists were arrested, but still, that's dramatic. One of those who was arrested was a communist member of parliament, Shapurji Saklatvala, who had been elected first as a Labour MP and then left the Labour Party and became a Communist MP for Battersea. I should say that Saklatvala, although he had very radical politics, his industrial record was a little bit more mixed because he was a scion of the Tata steel dynasty and was a very, very wealthy Indian man who came over to Britain to manage his family's steel interests in Britain. And in the British Gazette, Arthur Balfour, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, who at this time was still in the cabinet, he was now Lord President of the Council, wrote that the general strike was, quote, not a strike in the proper sense of the term. It is what I have called an attempted revolution. Well, I think this characterization is very unfair. I don't think at all, though, that revolution was the intention of the TUC or the unions. I don't think at all the TUC at any time was trying to bring down the Conservative government. I think the whole time they were focused on trying to get a better settlement, or indeed a settlement at all, for the miners who were being locked out and starved into work by their employers. And there's plenty of evidence for that, not just in what the TUC was saying. And as I mentioned in the British Worker, the TUC is constantly saying this, but also in their actions. The Soviet Union tries to send money to the TUC to show communist support and solidarity for the strikes, and the TUC refuses the transfer of funds. The government makes a big deal over the fact that the Soviet Union did transfer funds, less of a big deal about the fact the TUC turned them down, and so then the government imposes new restrictions on foreign payments into Britain. But it was a bit of a show anyway, because the TUC didn't want the money from the USSR, because they didn't want to be seen as supporting a revolutionary government. So I think it's all a load of nonsense used by the Conservatives, led by the hallowed Stanley Baldwin, to try to reduce public support for the strike, to justify very punitive measures against those involved in strike action.
You have focused, I think wisely for the case that you're making, on the desires of the TUC, of the Trade Union Congress and their leadership. And I think you're right that they did not want this to be a revolutionary moment, nor did they think it ought to end in that way. But in fact, many of them never really wanted this general strike at all. And one of the things that defines it, arguably one of the things that can define revolution in general, is that a group of people in charge can very easily lose control of events as they gain their own momentum. And clearly what ended up happening here, certainly my view of it, is that there were people who thought this was in part an attempted revolution. We've discussed the great proximity to revolutions elsewhere around the world. It's also a time of a lot of intellectual development on the left of British politics. People who are on the left are absorbing many more left-wing arguments than they would have been able to do previously. And I think this does feed into a culture and an atmosphere within the context of revolution around the world, which is highly charged. And in fact, when we look back on the general strike, part of the reason why we're talking about it, part of the reason why there are so many books that have come out about it to mark the centenary, part of the reason why people like Neil Kinnock talk about the way in which it lingered in people's minds and in people's hearts for decades and decades to come, is because for a lot of people, it did have that potential to be something much more revolutionary than just a dispute about the conditions of miners. This country's had lots of industrial disputes about things like the condition of miners. It had them before the First World War, it had them after the Second World War, or before the general strike. They never turned in to the mass walkout across sectors. It had them subsequently. We're going to talk in the rest of this podcast mini-series about other strikes, all of which involve the mines in the 1970s and the 1980s. They never turned into general strike. I think there is, for some people here, the potential to foment revolution, and that's partly what gives it this great energy. Because otherwise, what we're just dealing with is a level of industrial action that is totally out of proportion to the problem of the mining sector and the demands of the miners upon the people who own the coal mines. And if it wasn't totally out of proportion, then it would have been used again before and or since, as a way in order to try and leverage power. And that is one of the reasons why I think it is so important, actually, that the general strike ultimately failed, and why we should all celebrate its defeat. And in fact, people on the left in particular ought to celebrate its defeat, because I think it helps cement in the mind of a lot of people on the British left the idea that the road to socialism is through Parliament. The unions, as we've discussed, were not especially radical or revolutionary throughout this stage. But actually, if things had gone differently during the 9 days of general strike, that might have changed. If it had appeared during this incredibly febrile time as if actually calling out the first line of workers across all of these sectors was a way in which you could basically force the government's hand to get pretty much whatever you want, then maybe the intellectual energy and passion and work of the British left would not have been channeled into the Labour Party, would not have tried to use Parliament as the vehicle to achieve their aims, but would have instead formed some sort of radical syndicalism, which would have tried to redesign this country by mass walkout strikes and extra parliamentary action. I think that would have been much worse. And in fact, I would even go so far as to suggest that if the general strike had succeeded, God forbid, or even if it had just got much closer to succeeding, then we may in fact never have had the 1945 to 1951 Labour government in this country, because the left may not have worked and may not have organised in such a way as to mean that the Labour Party was in a position to deliver it. And so the defeat of the general strike, for me certainly, is the moment when really the best Labour government in this country's history became possible, because Parliament became the undoubted arena in which the British left would try and achieve their goals.
Well, I would have wanted the general strike to succeed, because what was the general strike about? As I said, it was about securing a better settlement for the mine workers. And I know there were all kinds of other elements that thought that this could be a vehicle for something else, but it was never in doubt that the people who were in charge of the strike wanted an industrial settlement and nothing more. And I think that's perfectly legitimate for unions to work together to try to achieve industrial settlement. Now, I do take your point, and this is what I was saying earlier, that ironically, the failure of the industrial strategy of the unions, I think, wins them over to the importance of a political strategy through achieving parliamentary power. And indeed, in the 1931 collapse of the Labour government, when Ramsay MacDonald betrays his comrades and goes into the national government with the Conservatives, it's really the unions that hold firm, stick with the Labour Party, and keep the show on the road. And Ernie Bevan, who had run the general strike, I think in many ways we can credit him with giving us Clement Attlee, because it's Bevan in 1935, on the eve of the 1935 election, who compels the Labour leader George Lansbury to resign a month before the general election, and his deputy becomes the acting leader of the Labour Party in the midst of a general election campaign, his deputy being Clement Attlee, and Attlee stays on as Labour leader for the next 20 years. So there is something to your thesis. I accept that.
Let's come on to the mechanics of how the general strike comes to an end. So, Richard, it's clear, I think, throughout the general strike, certainly for the people who are at the top of the TUC, and also really for many people in government, that it will not succeed. So how does it formally come to its end and fail?
Well, it's a very peculiar set of circumstances that led to the end of the general strike. And these have been cloaked and clothed in law and recriminations and mythology in the union movement ever since. But here's the basic story. So Herbert Samuel, that liberal politician who'd been the first British High Commissioner for the Palestine Mandate, who then Stanley Baldwin in the summer of 1925 had asked to write this Samuel report to create a new settlement for the mine industry, had issued that report in the spring of 1926 and then left the country. He goes off to Italy, to a villa, to spend time with his books and to relax after the exhaustion of writing his report. What a life. And so Samuel is in Italy, at the time that the general strike is taking place, because the general strike comes about over the failure of the Samuel Report. The unions and the mine owners cannot agree on the terms that Herbert Samuel had set out. So perhaps he should have stuck around. And Samuel hears about the general strike going on in England and Scotland and Wales, but not Northern Ireland. And he rings up Stanley Baldwin and says, I'll come back and sort it all out. And Baldwin says, no, that's fine. You've done enough damage. You can stay in Italy. The government is handling the situation. We'll sort it out. Well, Samuel would not take no for an answer. And so he, under his own initiative, makes his way across the continent. He gets to France. He takes a ship over to Dover. And such is the urgency of the crisis that he had arranged for a celebrity racing driver called Henry Seagrave to meet him at Dover and to speed him on to London at top speed in his famous racing car, Sunbeam. Samuel gets to London to meet the union leaders, but, and this goes into some of the recriminations that come later, not initially with the mine union leaders. And so he meets with the other union leaders at the home of Sir Abe Bailey, who was a diamond magnate from South Africa, who happened to be a chum of Jimmy Thomas, who was the railway workers union leader and was also a Labour MP and had also been Ramsay MacDonald's colonial secretary. It's a rather eccentric place to have this powwow in this mansion of a South African diamond mine owner about the working conditions of Britain's coal miners, without the coal miner workers union present, but in the presence of the other unions, meeting with this liberal politician when there's a conservative government, but people are thinking that the liberal politician is in some way representing the conservative government. And I suppose, although that sounds all completely mad, I suppose Jimmy Thomas's view on this was, well, Abe Bailey is this really rich mine owner, but he's also my mate. Jimmy Thomas came from a very poor working class background, like many of the members of the Ramsay MacDonald cabinet. He actually was working class, unlike what Keir Starmer has claimed about his cabinet. And he thought, well, if he's a friend of mine, then maybe this is the way that we find some kind of compromise. And so they start hashing out some kind of negotiated settlement about how to bring the general strike to an end. The mine workers union representatives do join, but not at the first stages of the conversations, and they come up with effectively an agreement, a memorandum of sorts, which is seen by the union leaders as a kind of peace treaty. The only problem is Herbert Samuel had no authority to negotiate on behalf of the government. As I had mentioned, Stanley Baldwin had told him to stay in Italy. And so the question here really is, going into this question about the law and recriminations around this, to what extent did the union leaders believe that Herbert Samuel was there on behalf of the government? Because there is a potential reading of this, which is maybe Herbert Samuel was not officially there on behalf of the government, but since the government had said that they would not open negotiations until the general strike ended, was Herbert Samuel actually being used by the government to open up negotiations to end the general strike in order to then have a settlement at the end of it? There are different theories about the intensity of that belief by the union leaders, but they basically seize upon Samuel's negotiations and call off the general strike. This comes like a bolt out of the blue for most of the workers who are involved in the general strike, because the general strike has actually gotten stronger over time, not weaker. One of the remarkable things about the general strike is that there are more workers who are on strike at the end of the general strike than were on strike at the beginning of the general strike. And speaking as someone who's been on long-running academic strikes over our pensions, I can tell you that by the end of the strike, the picket line has rather a few more gaps in it than at the start of the strike. It's almost always the case in my experience, in my limited experience as a middle-class academic, that day one of the picket line is the biggest day of the picket line. So it's a remarkable thing about the general strike that it got bigger as time went on. So why did the union leaders call an end to the general strike if the strike itself seemed to be working and seemed to be getting stronger? For some elements of the labor movement, this is seen as a great betrayal, a sellout, a surrender. I think that's a bit unfair. I think there are a couple of reasonable, plausible reasons why the union leaders ended the strike when they did. The first is that although the strike was successful, the strike was very costly to run for the unions. When you go on strike, you get strike pay in lieu of your wages. So one of the purposes of paying your monthly union dues is that the union is meant to set aside a pot of money so that when you go on strike, it's a bit like an insurance scheme, you can then claim out of that pot so you have money to cover your basic necessities while you're not being paid by your employer. Because, of course, when you go on strike, when you withdraw your labor, you don't get paid. And so that as the strike went on for the unions, paying strike pay was becoming crippling for union finances, particularly as more and more people were going on strike. The second reason is that some of the union leaders believed that the very existence of those unions could be called into question because of the general strike. The question here was the general strike a legal or illegal strike? Now, earlier in this episode, Lee, you suggested that it was an obviously legal strike, and I agree with you, but that was not seen as obvious at the time. And there were senior politicians, members of the government, who were calling it illegal. There were senior judges who, while not ruling directly on the strike, in what's known as obiter dicta, so speaking sort of around a topic rather than addressing the topic directly in a legal matter, had used the term illegal or unlawful with respect to the general strike. And the unions were worried that if there was a case over the legality of the general strike, that if they lost that case and the strike was found to be illegal, that all of the unions that had been involved in the general strike would be found financially culpable for the losses of the companies and the government that were sustained as a result of the strike, and that in one fell swoop, you would have financially crippled, destroyed the British trade union movement. And so with this reality facing them, the unions basically made a judgment that for the sake of the longer term survival of the British trade union movement, they had to take this somewhat dubious compromise from this liberal eccentric Herbert Samuel, take it as a victory and run with it.
Really, for me, the fundamental reason why the general strike ends is because there's a split between the Mine Workers Federation and the Trade Union Congress, the original union that had the grievance against their employers, and this big collective entity of unions. Because the mine workers can carry on their strike for as long as they like, and in fact they do carry on after the general strike. But it will not have the cross-industry, national, general significance unless the TUC itself is involved. And the TUC, for several reasons, not least those financial pressures, realise that they can't carry on. In fact, they're not willing to carry on. So this rupture between the TUC and one of its member unions basically means that the strike has no option but to come to an end. And the suggested resolution through Samuel is basically just the best premise for ending it, I think, that the TUC can find. What might have changed that, of course, would have been if the consequences of general strike within those 9 days that this was taking place had been so catastrophic, so crippling across the whole country, that it brought the government to the negotiating table on its knees, within the time frame that the TUC could afford to sustain itself with things like strike pay. But quite clearly, the scale of the government preparations and that remarkable wave of people who volunteered to try and keep the country functioning meant that, in fact, this was not going to be a situation in which the TUC could leverage themselves into a position of strength, certainly not within a fortnight, say, and therefore they were just always destined to lose. I don't want to be too negative about the strike necessarily, in the sense that it's of course legitimate, if you're in work and in a union, to withdraw your labour as a negotiating strategy in order to get better terms. But if it doesn't have the desired effect of actually adding pressure to the government or adding pressure to your employers, then what is the point of carrying on? If the government has proved itself resilient, as it did in this case, then what is the strike achieving? I mean, sure, it's raising the passions of red-blooded radicals throughout the country, but it's not clear that it was on course to do all that much else. And the real tragedy, in many ways, in fact, the great tragedy of all of this, is that the mine workers ended up being the real victims of the general strike. And truly, I think they were. But I think they were the victims of the radicalism of some people within the wider movement and within their own trade union. Because they are the ones who end up still out of work. They are the ones who end up going back to work on worse terms. Because they are the ones who have, by some of the more radical people in their trade union, been marched up the hill without a clear plan of how to actually win. Richard, as this whole episode, really, this two-parter on the general strike, is really in the realm of left-wing politics, I ought to give you the final word. So what were, in your view, the consequences and the aftermath of the general strike?
Well, I think for the British working classes, the consequences in the immediate and medium term were not good. It was a form of unconditional surrender, really. The Samuel Compromise meant nothing. Certainly in industrial terms, the unions got nothing really that they had asked for. Ernest Bevin said on the day that the strike ended that the best way to describe today is that we have committed suicide. And for the miners, the situation became even more desperate. The miner dispute with the employers carried on right from May into November. They were in a lockout. So this notion that an employer refuses to allow you to come back to work until you agree to the new terms and conditions of employment, which in the case of the miners was a substantial pay cut and longer hours. And the dispute between the miners and the mine owners only came to an end because the miners were effectively starved back into work. And they experienced many, many more months of real poverty. Many of the miners, but also other workers who had been active in the strike, who had been organizers for their union branches, who had been on the forefront of picket lines, were then subsequently punished by their employers for doing so. In some cases, they were sacked by their employers for their involvement in the general strike. In other cases, not just in the mining industry, but actually in other industries, workers returned to face the prospect of lockouts in their own industries and therefore had to capitulate to their own worse terms and conditions. There were individuals who were blacklisted, and basically employers collectively agreed not to employ certain people because they were seen to be particularly militant in the general strike. And so the employers effectively conspired to make some people long-term unemployed. But I should say that for all of that disappointment and defeat, the general strike had a really important impact on the generation of particularly people in the labor movement who lived through the general strike, or who were even children of those or even grandchildren of those who were involved in the general strike. You had, of course, the star of the show, Ernest Bevin, the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, the central organizer of the general strike, who goes on to become, in 1940, Minister for Labour under, wait for it, Winston Churchill. His great enemy in the general strike appoints him into his government, into his wartime cabinet. And it's an extraordinary appointment because when Churchill appoints Bevin to the cabinet, Bevin isn't even a member of the House of Commons or the House of Lords. He's just a trade union leader. And a seat has to be found in the middle of the war for Bevin to be made MP for Wandsworth. But there's a period of time when Bevin is Minister for Labour without sitting in either House of Parliament. Maybe Andy Burnham's ears are pricking up when I say these things. There were future Labour luminaries who were shaped by the experience of the strike in different ways. For Nye Bevan, the founder of the National Health Service, who's a union organizer for the mines in South Wales, himself being a miner, the experience of the general strike forms and solidifies in him that burning passion of hatred for the Conservatives, where he does call them lower than vermin. And Bevan, unlike Bevin, decides not to become part of the wartime government and is an opponent and a critic of Churchill, even during the Second World War. He's one of Winston Churchill's most vocal critics. So for some people, the wounds that they sustained during the general strike did not heal. You also had unlikely people who were shaped by the general strike. Hugh Gaitskell, who wasn't a miner, who was privately educated, middle-class academic, becomes politicized, he says, by the experience of the general strike. And while so many others in Oxford were scabbing, or if you don't like the word scabbingly, volunteering to undermine the strike effort, Hugh Gaitskell is working with fellow radicals at Oxford like G.D.H. Cole to support the working class who were on strike in Oxford as part of the Oxford University Strike Committee. And then you have other unlikely people like Roy Jenkins, whose father was a miner and was imprisoned during the general strike. And it's one of the things that years later, Tony Benn reminds Roy Jenkins of and says that, you know, Roy, your father was a miner and you owe everything to the labor movement. And when you talk about cancers, I think of people who are cancers when they turn their back on the labor movement that gave them everything. And there are still people who are alive today who are children of the general strike. Dennis Skinner, who is the long-serving Labour MP for Bolsover from 1970 to 2019, who's still alive, God bless him, in his 90s, was the son of a Derbyshire miner who was a union activist and was blacklisted in the general strike and really struggled to find work as a result of that. And Dennis Skinner grew up, I think he was like one of 8 children. Skinner himself is a former miner. Although he was born after the general strike, he was one of the younger kids. He remembers the long-term consequences of his father not being able to work in certain pits because he was known to be a union organizer. And the final thing I'll say on this is that the last, I think, living person to remember the general strike only died this year. We did an episode on him. Sir Patrick Duffy, the Labour MP, who was the son of a Wigan miner, died this year at the age of 105. And Duffy claimed that he could remember as a 5-year-old boy joining with the other children in the miners' hall, being taught the red flag to sing for all of the miners in the miners' hall during the general strike. And although he just died short of the 100th anniversary. It's extraordinary to think that 100 years on, we were still so close to someone who had a living memory of this profound moment in British industrial history.
We finish as ever with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. I'll go first. So I'm currently reading what's one of the seminal books, really, on 20th century British history, or I should say English history, because the book is called English History 1914 to 1945 by A.J.P. Taylor. It's part of the Oxford History of England series, which goes right back to when the Romans were here and takes us up to the end of the Second World War. And it's this enormous shelf load of books that you can often find in libraries in this duck egg blue colour, and occasionally you'll find it at a snip in charity shops, which is where I happen to find this. It's an incredibly readable book. It's unavoidably quick and fast-paced in terms of the progress that it goes through. It's covering such a huge period of time, from the beginning of the First World War through the interwar years to victory in the Second World War. So there's a huge amount to cram in, even though it isn't a short book in and of itself. Taylor has this tremendous habit of making really quite sweeping statements, but statements which always make you think that they're his reasoned judgment of a tremendous amount of knowledge and thought, rather than just things that, at least most of the time anyway, feel like they're just slightly glib, dismissive, fatuous comments that feel like they're fun or witty to say. Now, he has this grand approach that the vast majority of times, I think it's fair to say, he gets away with. One of the things that I particularly like about the way in which he writes is that some of the juiciest nuggets of information in the book, and analysis and commentary too, is found in the footnotes. So whereas quite often you might be reading a book and just skip over the small text at the bottom altogether, he constantly keeps your eye shifting to the bottom of the page so that you don't miss out on some of the more interesting comments. What got me reading this is that I'm really keen this summer to spend a lot of time reading more about and learning more about the interwar years. And I've picked up about a dozen books that look at the political, social, intellectual trends and themes of that period, in Britain in particular. And I did just want to say, as we're doing this podcast, that if there's anybody else who's keen to learn more about that period of time, I'm thinking of making a little chat or a community where we could share thoughts on the books and reading lists and what it is that we're reading about that period in time. So if you're interested in joining that, do send me a note. My email address is in the show notes, and I'll be in touch. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
For this episode, I want to recommend to our readers the great new book by David Torrance on the general strike called The Edge of Revolution, the general strike that shook Britain. This book, I have to give great credit to for being a major source of anecdotes and information that helped shape this two-part episode. David is a great writer. He has a real eye for color, for making a story come alive. And I think part of that is because David tends to tell his histories through people. And it's in the experience of different people at different levels of the strike, on different sides of the strike, that gives you this well-rounded view of the strike. It gives you quite a fair and I think balanced view of the strike. I think David doesn't come with an axe to grind, unlike I think some of the other books that have come out on the general strike that are highly sympathetic or highly critical of it. He's a great writer, and I recommend him to our listeners.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode. We'll be back on Thursday with our next Matters of Interest, and then on Sunday with part 2 of the Strikes mini-series, we will be looking at Edward Heath's bust-up with the trade unions in the early 1970s. Those were the events that brought about the 3-day week and ultimately brought down Edward Heath and his government. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.